Hello, my friend. Welcome to Sleepy Wilds. I'm glad you're here tonight. My name is Oliver, and it's my quiet privilege to be the voice that keeps you company as you drift off to sleep. Tonight's story is called A Snail's Quiet Reign. It is, I should warn you, an extremely boring story. It is about a snail. The snail does very little. It moves slowly. It rains. That's essentially it. I genuinely cannot promise you that anything of any significance will happen at all. In fact, I can almost guarantee that it won't. But before we begin tonight's story, let's take a few minutes together. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. And as I do, I'd like you to allow yourself to let go, just a little more with each number. 10. Feel the weight of your body right now. Feel the surface beneath you, whether that's your mattress, your pillow, your blanket. Feel how it holds you. You don't have to hold yourself up tonight. You can let it do that for you. 9. Notice your breathing. Don't try to change it. Just notice it. In and out. Slow and steady, the way it always is when you stop paying attention to it. 8. The day is done now. Whatever happened today has already happened. Your thoughts about it won't change anything tonight. So gently, without forcing anything, see if you can set it down. Just for now. The rain continued to fall on the garden at 14 Orchard Lane, steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been doing for the past several hours. Gerald did not have any thoughts about this, as snails do not have thoughts in any meaningful sense that has been scientifically established. The garden remained quiet. Nothing of any particular significance occurred. The rain fell on the shed roof with a faint pattering sound. The shed contained the same items it had contained before. 7. Notice if there's any tension you're still holding. Maybe in your shoulders or your jaw or your hands. Just notice it. And see if, very gently, you can soften there. Just slightly. That's enough. 6. You are safe. This is your time. Nobody needs anything from you right now. There is nothing you are supposed to be doing except this. Resting. Letting go. Allowing yourself to be still. 5. Begin to let the sounds around you become less important. If you hear anything, a car outside, a door somewhere, anything at all, just let it be there without following it. Let it pass the way clouds pass across a dark sky. 4. Your body has worked hard today. It is ready for rest. Allow it to feel heavy now. Your legs, your arms, your hands. All of it. Heavy and warm and perfectly still. 3. Begin to imagine, if you can, a very quiet garden. It is evening. It has been raining for some time. The garden is small. It belongs to a semi-detached house on a road called Orchard Lane in a town called Martin Wick, which has a population of approximately 11,400 people and a high street containing a post office, a pharmacy, and a bakery that has been closed since February. 2. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing stay slow. Let your thoughts drift wherever they want to go. You don't need to follow them. 1. Completely letting go now. And as you do, let me tell you about the snail. Gerald moved at his usual pace, which was slow. This was not unusual for Gerald. It was simply how Gerald moved. The concrete path continued to be wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same size as it had been previously. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, a car drove slowly along Orchard Lane. It did not stop at number 14. The grass continued to be approximately 6 centimeters tall. This had not changed significantly since the last. It had been raining in Martin Wick since approximately 2 on a Thursday afternoon in October. The rain had begun as a light drizzle, which the weather app on a nearby resident's phone had described as 1 out of 5 on a precipitation scale, before increasing to a steady, moderate rainfall by 3:30. The garden at 14 Orchard Lane was 42 square meters in total area. It contained a lawn, which had not been mowed since the second week of September, a raised flower bed along the left-hand fence containing 3 rose bushes and a number of plants the owner could not identify, a garden shed, and a concrete path that ran from the back door to the shed. On a large, flat stone at the base of the raised flower bed, there lived a snail. The snail was approximately 3.4 centimeters in length when fully extended, with a shell that measured 2.1 centimeters across at its widest point. The shell was brown with faint amber spiral markings. It was not, by any objective measure, a particularly remarkable shell. It was a perfectly average shell for a snail of this type, which was a garden snail, also known by its scientific name, Cornu aspersum. The snail's name was not known, as snails do not have names. For the purposes of this story, we will call him Gerald. This is purely for convenience. The rain continued to fall on the garden at 14 Orchard Lane, steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been doing for the past several hours. Gerald did not have any thoughts about this, as snails do not have thoughts in any meaningful sense that has been scientifically established. The garden remained quiet. Nothing of any particular significance occurred. The rain fell on the shed roof with a faint pattering sound. The shed contained the same items it had contained before. Gerald had been sheltering beneath the edge of the flat stone since approximately 1:30 that afternoon, which was approximately 50 minutes before the rain began. He had not known it was going to rain. Snails do not check weather apps. He had simply been beneath the stone because the stone was where he usually was during the middle part of the day, when the light was brightest and the air was driest. The stone itself was a piece of York sandstone, roughly rectangular, measuring approximately 31 centimeters by 19 centimeters, and weighing an estimated 4.2 kilograms. It had been placed in its current position by the garden's previous owner, a retired schoolteacher named Barbara Hewson, who had moved to the property in 2004 and had purchased the stone from a garden center near the motorway for £6.50, including a small discount because it had a minor chip in one corner. Barbara had since moved to a smaller property in a nearby village. The current owners of the house, a couple called the Pattersons, had not moved the stone. They were not sure what the stone was for. They had discussed it once, briefly, in March, and had agreed to leave it where it was. Gerald was unaware of any of this. Gerald was a snail. Gerald moved at his usual pace, which was slow. This was not unusual for Gerald. It was simply how Gerald moved. The concrete path continued to be wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same size as it had been previously. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, a car drove slowly along Orchard Lane. It did not stop at number 14. The grass continued to be approximately 6 centimeters tall. This had not changed significantly since the last time it was mentioned. The rain continued to fall on the garden at 14 Orchard Lane, steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been. At 3:47 in the afternoon, Gerald began to move. He extended himself slowly from beneath the edge of the flat stone, antennae emerging first, then his head, then the rest of his soft, unhurried body. The entire process of emerging took approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which is a perfectly normal amount of time for a garden snail to take when emerging from beneath a stone. The rain was still falling. Gerald did not appear particularly bothered by this. Snails are, in general, quite comfortable in the rain. Rain keeps the ground moist, which is preferable for movement. Dry conditions are more of a concern for a snail than wet ones. Gerald moved out onto the damp surface of the flat stone with the particular slow confidence of a creature that has absolutely nowhere to be and is in no hurry whatsoever to get there. His pace of movement was approximately 48 meters per hour when measured on flat ground in optimal conditions, though on a damp stone in the rain on a Thursday afternoon in October, Gerald was moving at something closer to 31 meters per hour. He was covering approximately 8.6 millimeters every second. This meant that crossing the flat stone, which was 31 centimeters long, would take Gerald approximately 36 seconds. It took him 41 seconds. He paused twice. Gerald did not have any thoughts about this, as snails do not have thoughts in any meaningful sense that has been scientifically established. The garden remained quiet. Nothing of any particular significance occurred. The rain fell on the shed roof with a faint pattering sound. The shed contained the same items it had contained before. Gerald moved at his usual pace, which was slow. This was not unusual for Gerald. It was simply how Gerald moved. Gerald reached the edge of the flat stone at approximately 3:52 in the afternoon and paused there for a moment, antennae gently probing the air ahead of him. The air smelled of rain and wet soil and a faint trace of something organic that Gerald's limited sensory apparatus registered without any particular opinion about it. Below the edge of the stone, the garden path was wet. The path was made of concrete that had been laid in 2011 by a man called Terry from a local building firm who had charged £340 for the job, including materials. There was a small crack running diagonally across the path near the center, which had appeared in the winter of 2019 and had been discussed by the Pattersons on at least 3 occasions without any action being taken. Gerald descended from the stone to the path. This took him approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The concrete was damp beneath him. The rain continued to fall in steady, quiet drops, landing on the path with a faint pattering sound, on the leaves of the unidentified plants in the flower bed with a slightly softer sound, and on Gerald's shell with no sound at all that was audible to anything except possibly Gerald himself, and even that is unlikely. Gerald moved slowly along the path in the direction of the lawn. The concrete path continued to be wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same size as it had been previously. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, a car drove slowly along Orchard Lane. It did not stop at number 14. The grass continued to be approximately 6 centimeters tall. This had not changed significantly since the last time it was mentioned. The rain continued to fall on the garden at 14 Orchard Lane, steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been doing for the past several hours. The lawn at 14 Orchard Lane had last been mowed on the 12th of September, a Saturday morning, by Mr. Patterson, using a Bosch electric lawnmower that he had bought 4 years ago from a DIY superstore on a retail park outside town. The mower had a cutting width of 32 centimeters and a grass collection box with a capacity of 40 liters. The grass collection box had been 3/4 full by the time Mr. Patterson finished, which had taken approximately 25 minutes including the time he spent untangling the cable from a garden chair he had not moved before he started. Since the 12th of September, the grass had grown to a height of approximately 6 centimeters, which was within the range considered normal for an unmowed lawn in early October in a temperate climate. Gerald reached the edge of the lawn at approximately 3:58. He paused at the point where the concrete path met the grass. His antennae moved slowly, taking in the change in texture and scent. The grass was wet and cool. Several individual grass blades were bent under the weight of small water droplets. Gerald moved forward onto the lawn, his foot making no sound at all against the soft, wet grass. The rain continued to fall, steady and unhurried, onto the lawn, the path, the flat stone, and Gerald. Gerald did not have any thoughts about this, as snails do not have thoughts in any meaningful sense that has been scientifically established. The garden remained quiet. Nothing of any particular significance occurred. The rain fell on the shed roof with a faint pattering sound. The shed contained the same items it had contained before. Gerald moved at his usual pace, which was slow. This was not unusual for Gerald. It was simply how Gerald moved. The concrete path continued to be wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same size as it had been previously. Gerald had been moving across the lawn for approximately 7 minutes when he reached a fallen leaf. The leaf was from a sycamore tree in the neighboring garden at number 16, which had a trunk circumference of approximately 83 centimeters and was estimated to be between 35 and 40 years old. The leaf had fallen sometime that morning and had been gradually flattening under its own weight and the rain since approximately 11:15. The leaf was 12 centimeters long and 9 centimeters wide at its widest point. It was yellow-green at the center and had begun to turn brown at the edges. Gerald approached the leaf from its left side, which from the leaf's perspective was its right side, though as the leaf had no perspective this is perhaps not a useful distinction. Gerald paused when he reached the edge of the leaf. He extended his antennae toward it for a moment. Then he began to climb onto the leaf. The leaf dipped very slightly under Gerald's weight, which was approximately 10 grams including his shell. The movement was so small as to be almost imperceptible. The leaf settled again immediately. The rain fell on the leaf with a faint sound slightly different from the sound it made on the wet grass, a small, soft tap, repeated at irregular intervals. Gerald ate a small piece of the leaf's edge. It took him approximately 3 minutes. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, a car drove slowly along Orchard Lane. It did not stop at number 14. The grass continued to be approximately 6 centimeters tall. This had not changed significantly since the last time it was mentioned. The rain continued to fall on the garden at 14 Orchard Lane, steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been doing for the past several hours. Gerald did not have any thoughts about this, as snails do not have thoughts in any meaningful sense that has. The portion of leaf that Gerald consumed measured approximately 4 millimeters by 3 millimeters and weighed an amount too small to calculate with any accuracy using standard household equipment. It was, for Gerald, a perfectly adequate small meal. Gerald remained on the leaf for a further 11 minutes after finishing eating. During this time he did not move significantly. He remained at the edge of the leaf with his antennae partly retracted, which in a snail can indicate a degree of rest or contentment, though snail researchers are cautious about attributing specific emotional states to snails, as the evidence base is limited. The rain continued during this period at roughly the same intensity it had been maintaining since approximately 3 in the afternoon. A small rivulet of water had formed along the edge of the concrete path and was running slowly toward the drain near the back wall of the garden. The drain had been installed in 2003 and was covered by a metal grate, approximately 20 centimeters square, manufactured by a company in the West Midlands. The rivulet reached the drain and disappeared. Another rivulet formed immediately behind it. This had been happening continuously for some time. The garden shed, which contained a lawn mower, 2 folding chairs, a bag of compost, and an unopened tin of wood stain, remained dry throughout. The garden remained quiet. Nothing of any particular significance occurred. The rain fell on the shed roof with a faint pattering sound. The shed contained the same items it had contained before. Gerald moved at his usual pace, which was slow. This was not unusual for Gerald. It was simply how Gerald moved. The concrete path continued to be wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same size as it had been previously. At 4:23 in the afternoon, Gerald moved off the leaf and continued across the lawn in the general direction of the flower bed, though to describe this as a direction implies a degree of intentionality that may not be entirely accurate. The lawn between the fallen leaf and the flower bed was a distance of approximately 1.4 meters. At Gerald's current pace, this would take him approximately 3 minutes and 10 seconds under normal circumstances. It took him 4 minutes and 40 seconds, as he paused once near a small twig, investigated it briefly with his antennae for approximately 40 seconds, found it uninteresting, and moved on. The flower bed contained, in addition to the 3 rose bushes and the unidentified plants, a quantity of dark brown compost that had been applied by the previous owner Barbara Hewson in the spring of 2011 and had since been significantly supplemented by natural decomposition. The soil was dark and very damp from the rain. It smelled strongly of earth. Gerald reached the edge of the flower bed and began to move up the small wooden border that separated the bed from the lawn. The border was 3.5 centimeters high. It took Gerald approximately 90 seconds to climb it. He paused once near the top. The rain continued, soft and steady, as it had been all afternoon. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, a car drove slowly along Orchard Lane. It did not stop at number 14. The grass continued to be approximately 6 centimeters tall. This had not changed significantly since the last time it was mentioned. The rain continued to fall on the garden at 14 Orchard Lane, steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been doing for the past several hours. Gerald did not have any thoughts about this, as snails do not have thoughts in any meaningful sense that has been scientifically. Gerald reached the top of the wooden border at 4:25 and paused there for approximately 30 seconds before descending into the flower bed on the other side. The descent took him 1 minute and 5 seconds, which was slightly longer than the ascent, as descending on a damp wooden surface presented different traction conditions than ascending. Gerald managed it without any significant incident. The soil in the flower bed was dark and soft beneath him, considerably different in texture from the concrete path and the lawn grass he had crossed earlier. Gerald moved slowly through the flower bed, between the base of a rose bush and a cluster of low-growing plants that Mrs. Patterson had purchased from a garden center the previous April in a tray of 6 for £4.99, intending to look up what they were when she got home. She had not yet done this. The plants had grown reasonably well regardless. The rose bush nearest to Gerald was the second of the 3 rose bushes in the bed. It had produced 11 roses during the summer, of which 7 had been cut and brought inside by Mrs. Patterson at various points between June and August. The remaining 4 had been left on the bush and had gradually dried and browned. 1 had fallen off entirely in a light wind in late September. The remaining 3 were still on the bush, damp and slightly flattened by the rain. Gerald moved past the rose bush without pausing. The rain fell steadily on the soil around him, making small dark indentations where each drop landed. At the far end of the flower bed, there was a gap of approximately 4 centimeters between the fence panel and the end of the wooden border. Gerald reached this gap at 4:31 and paused. He extended his antennae through the gap and held them there for approximately 25 seconds. Then he withdrew his antennae and remained still for a further 40 seconds. Then he turned, very slowly, and began moving back the way he had come. It is not known what, if anything, Gerald perceived through the gap, or whether his decision to turn was in any way connected to what his antennae had detected. Snail researchers would note that snails respond to chemical signals in their environment and that Gerald's behavior was consistent with a normal navigational response to environmental information. Others might simply say that Gerald changed his mind. Whether snails have minds in any meaningful sense is a question that falls outside the scope of this story. Gerald moved back through the flower bed at his usual pace. He passed the unidentified plants again. He passed the second rose bush again. He passed the first rose bush, which was slightly larger than the second and had produced 13 roses during the summer, of which 9 had been cut. He reached the wooden border and paused at its base. The rain continued to fall. Nothing else of any particular significance occurred during this period. Gerald began climbing the wooden border again at 4:38. The border was, as previously noted, 3.5 centimeters high. Gerald had now climbed this border twice within the same afternoon, making a total cumulative border climbing distance of 7 centimeters for the day. This was not, by any measure, a record for Gerald or for garden snails generally. At the top of the border, Gerald paused again. He was now facing the lawn. The lawn stretched ahead of him, wet and slightly flattened by the rain, toward the concrete path and the flat stone beyond it. The light had changed since Gerald had first crossed the lawn approximately 41 minutes earlier. The afternoon had moved further toward evening, and the quality of the gray October light filtering down through the low cloud cover was now slightly dimmer than before. Not dramatically so. Just slightly. Mr. Patterson had turned the kitchen light on at some point in the last 20 minutes, and a faint yellow rectangle of light was now falling from the kitchen window across the left portion of the path. Gerald was not in this rectangle of light. Gerald was approximately 1.3 meters to the right of it. Gerald descended from the border onto the lawn and began crossing it again. The rain continued at the same steady pace it had been maintaining for the past 2 hours and 13 minutes. Gerald crossed the lawn for the second time that afternoon, arriving back at the concrete path at approximately 4:47. He had covered the 1.4-meter distance in 4 minutes and 52 seconds, which was slightly faster than his outward crossing, possibly due to the ground being more thoroughly saturated now and therefore slightly more conducive to snail movement. Possibly not. It is difficult to draw firm conclusions from a sample size of 2 crossings. Gerald moved across the concrete path toward the flat stone. The crack in the path, which was still approximately the same width as it had been earlier, crossed Gerald's path at an angle. Gerald encountered the crack at 4:49 and paused briefly to investigate it with his antennae. The crack was approximately 4 millimeters wide at its widest point. Gerald moved over it without difficulty. It did not present a meaningful obstacle to a snail of Gerald's size and capability. The flat stone was now visible ahead. The stone was wet, as it had been before, and as it had been for most of the afternoon. Its surface was darker than it would appear in dry conditions, the sandstone having absorbed a quantity of water that would gradually evaporate once the rain stopped, assuming the rain stopped at some point, which the weather app on the nearby resident's phone suggested it would, at around 7:15 that evening. Gerald reached the flat stone at 4:52. Gerald climbed onto the flat stone at 4:52 and 11 seconds. The stone's surface was, as noted, wet and slightly darker than its usual color. Gerald moved to approximately the center of the stone and stopped. He remained there, partially retracted into his shell, for a period of 6 minutes and 40 seconds. During this time, he did not move in any meaningful way. His antennae were partly withdrawn. The rain fell on his shell and ran off in very small quantities. In the kitchen of number 14, Mrs. Patterson was making a cup of tea. She filled the kettle with water from the tap. The kettle held up to 1.7 liters. Mrs. Patterson filled it to the 1-cup line, which corresponded to approximately 350 milliliters. She placed the kettle on its base and switched it on. The kettle took 2 minutes and 14 seconds to boil. She placed a tea bag in a mug that said, "World's Okayest Gardener," on it, which had been given to her as a gift by her sister at Christmas the previous year. She poured the water over the tea bag and waited 90 seconds before removing the tea bag with a spoon. She added a small amount of semi-skimmed milk from a 2-pint plastic bottle that had been opened that morning. She did not add sugar. Gerald remained on the flat stone. The rain continued. Mrs. Patterson brought her tea to the kitchen table and sat down. The kitchen table was a rectangular pine table measuring 120 centimeters by 80 centimeters, which the Pattersons had bought from a furniture shop in the retail park when they moved into the house 7 years ago. It had cost £219. One of its legs had developed a very slight wobble in the 3rd year, which Mr. Patterson had addressed by placing a small folded piece of cardboard beneath it. The cardboard was still there. Mrs. Patterson looked out of the kitchen window at the garden. The garden was dark and wet and largely indistinguishable from how it usually looked on a rainy October evening. She could see the concrete path and the edge of the lawn and the vague dark shape of the shed. She could not see Gerald from where she was sitting, as Gerald was on the flat stone, which was on the far side of the raised flower bed and not visible from the kitchen window unless you stood close to it and looked at a specific angle. Mrs. Patterson drank her tea. The tea was at approximately 63 degrees when she began drinking it, which is within the range that most people find comfortable for a hot beverage. Gerald remained on the flat stone. He had not moved since arriving there at 4:52. The rain continued to fall on the garden, on the path, on the shed, and on Gerald. At 5:03, Gerald began to move again. He moved toward the right-hand edge of the flat stone, which was the edge closest to the wooden fence. He reached the edge in approximately 40 seconds and descended back onto the soil at the base of the stone. The soil here was very wet. Gerald's foot left a faint trail in it as he moved, though this trail would be largely invisible to a casual observer and entirely invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Gerald moved along the base of the wall at a pace consistent with his earlier movements that afternoon. He followed no particular straight line. His path curved slightly to the left, then slightly to the right, in the way that snail paths generally do, driven by minute variations in the surface and by the snail's own sensory responses to whatever information its antennae were gathering. Above Gerald, the fence panels of the garden boundary were damp with rain. They were lap panel fencing, each panel measuring 1.8 meters in height and 1.8 meters in width. There were 7 panels in total along the left boundary and 6 along the right. They had been replaced in 2017 by a contractor who had charged £840 for the job. One of the panels on the right-hand side had a small split in it that had appeared the previous winter. It had not been repaired. Gerald was not interested in any of this. Gerald moved along the base of the stone. At 5:11, Gerald reached a small cluster of moss that had grown at the base of the fence where the fence met the soil. The moss covered an area of approximately 14 square centimeters and was very green and very damp. Gerald stopped at the edge of the moss and extended his antennae toward it for 30 seconds. Then he moved onto it. The moss was soft beneath Gerald. It was a different texture from the concrete, from the grass, from the wooden border, and from the soil. It yielded slightly under his weight, which was, as previously noted, approximately 10 grams including his shell. The moss sprang back very slightly once he had passed over each part of it, though not to its precise original position. Moss that has been compressed by the passage of a snail typically recovers its shape within a few hours under damp conditions. Gerald moved slowly through the moss. He paused once near what appeared to be a small piece of decomposed leaf material that was partially incorporated into the surface of the moss. He investigated it briefly with his antennae. He ate a small amount of it. The amount he consumed was very small. Estimating it with precision would require equipment that is not generally available in domestic settings. The rain continued to fall. In the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson had finished her tea and was looking at something on her phone. The mug with the world's okayest gardener slogan was on the table beside her, empty. Gerald left the moss at 5:19 and continued along the base of the fence. He was now moving parallel to the right-hand fence, heading in a direction that, if continued, would bring him back toward the area of the flat stone and the flower bed, though it would take him some considerable time to get there and there was no particular reason to assume he would continue in a straight line. The light in the garden was noticeably dimmer now than it had been when Gerald first emerged from beneath the flat stone. The sun had set at 5:04 according to the weather app, though given the heavy cloud cover it had not been visible in any meaningful sense for several hours before that. The garden was now lit primarily by the rectangle of yellow light from the kitchen window and by a small amount of ambient light from the overcast sky, which reflected the light of the town back down onto itself in a faint orange-gray glow. Mr. Patterson had arrived home at 5:12. He had come in through the front door, hung his coat on the hook in the hall, removed his shoes and placed them on the shoe rack, and gone to the kitchen. He had asked Mrs. Patterson if she had had a good day. She had said it had been fine. He had made himself a cup of tea using the same process Mrs. Patterson had used earlier, though he had added 1 sugar. He was now sitting at the kitchen table on the opposite side from where Mrs. Patterson had been sitting. Gerald continued to move slowly along the base of the fence, unaware of all of this. At 5:27, Gerald reached a point along the fence base where a small stone, separate from the flat stone, was partially embedded in the soil. This stone was much smaller than the flat stone. It was approximately 5 centimeters long and 3 centimeters wide and had no particular significance. It had been there for some years, deposited either during the original construction of the garden or by some subsequent process that it is not possible to determine with any confidence. Gerald paused at this small stone for approximately 1 minute and 20 seconds. He investigated it with his antennae. He did not eat any of it, as it was a stone and not edible. He then moved around the left side of the stone and continued in the direction he had been traveling. The rain, which had been falling steadily since approximately 2:20 that afternoon, was beginning very slightly to ease. The droplets were falling at the same pace but were marginally smaller than they had been at the height of the rainfall around 4 o'clock. The weather app had predicted this. The rivulet along the concrete path was still flowing but had reduced slightly in volume. Gerald moved on through the damp garden, following whatever path his antennae and the surface beneath him suggested, in no particular hurry, with no particular destination, as the evening settled quietly and completely over 14 Orchard Lane, over Orchard Lane itself, and over Martin Wick, which had a population of approximately 11,400 people, most of whom were now indoors. At 5:31, Gerald stopped moving. He had come to rest at the base of the fence, approximately 37 centimeters from the small embedded stone he had investigated 4 minutes earlier. There was no particular reason, as far as could be determined, why Gerald had stopped at this precise location rather than any other location along the fence. The soil here was similar in composition and moisture content to the soil he had been crossing for the past several minutes. The fence panel directly above him was the fourth panel from the back of the garden on the right-hand side, which was one of the panels that had not been replaced in 2017 and was therefore of the original construction, date unknown. Gerald partially retracted into his shell. His antennae were fully withdrawn. He remained in this position. Inside the house, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson had begun discussing what to have for dinner. Mrs. Patterson suggested pasta. Mr. Patterson said that was fine. Mrs. Patterson said she thought there was some penne in the cupboard. Mr. Patterson said he thought there might also be some rigatoni. They agreed that either would be suitable. Mrs. Patterson went to check the cupboard. There was penne. There was also rigatoni. There were also 2 other types of pasta whose names Mrs. Patterson could not immediately recall, which were in fact farfalle and orzo. She took out the penne. Gerald remained at the base of the fence. The rain continued to fall, slightly lighter than before but still consistent. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. The rain continued, or did not continue, depending on which part of the evening is being described. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This had been the case for some time and continued to be the case. Mrs. Patterson filled a large saucepan with water from the kitchen tap and placed it on the hob. She turned the hob to setting 7, which on their particular hob, a 4-burner gas hob that had come with the house when they bought it, was approximately 2/3 of the maximum heat setting. The pan would take approximately 8 minutes to reach a full boil at this setting. While the water was heating, Mrs. Patterson opened the fridge and took out a jar of pasta sauce, 2/3 of a courgette, and a small block of Parmesan cheese. The pasta sauce was a brand called Dolmio, specifically the Bolognese variety, in a 750-gram jar. The jar had been opened on Tuesday and approximately 200 grams had already been used. There remained approximately 550 grams, which was sufficient for 2 portions. The courgette had been bought on Saturday from the supermarket. It had originally been part of a 3-pack. 1 courgette had been used in a stir-fry on Monday. The second, which was the one now on the kitchen counter, had been unused until this point. The third courgette had been placed at the back of the fridge and had developed a soft patch on one end that morning. Mrs. Patterson had thrown it away. Outside, Gerald had not moved since 5:31. He remained at the base of the fence, partially retracted into his shell, in the rain. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items it had contained previously. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width as it had been earlier. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was not relevant to Gerald or to the garden at number 14. The water in the saucepan reached boiling point at 5:43. Mrs. Patterson added a pinch of salt, which she took from a small ceramic salt pig on the counter beside the hob. The salt pig had been a gift from Mr. Patterson's mother and had a small chip in the rim that had been there since approximately 2 years after they received it. Mrs. Patterson added 180 grams of penne to the boiling water, which she had measured using a digital kitchen scale that sat on the counter to the left of the hob. The recommended cooking time for the penne, according to the instructions on the packet, was 11 minutes for al dente or 13 minutes for a softer texture. Mrs. Patterson preferred al dente. Mr. Patterson did not have a strong preference but was willing to eat al dente. Gerald began moving again at 5:44. He had been stationary for 13 minutes. He moved away from the fence in the direction of the lawn, crossing a distance of approximately 12 centimeters before pausing again near a small cluster of dead grass at the edge of the lawn. He investigated the dead grass with his antennae. The dead grass yielded no information that caused Gerald to change his direction or pace in any noticeable way. He moved onto the lawn and continued. The rain was lighter now. Still falling, but noticeably lighter than the steady rainfall of earlier in the afternoon. Individual drops were visible on the kitchen window. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. The rain continued, or did not continue, depending on which part of the evening is being described. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This had been the case for some time and continued to be the case. Gerald moved across the lawn in the direction of the flat stone. He was not necessarily heading toward the flat stone intentionally. He was simply moving in a direction that happened to be roughly toward the flat stone. The flat stone was approximately 1.1 meters away. At 5:48, a cat appeared on top of the fence at the right-hand side of the garden. The cat belonged to the household at number 18, 2 doors down. Its name was Biscuit. It was a tabby cat, predominantly gray with darker gray stripes, approximately 4 years old and weighing an estimated 4.2 kilograms, which was slightly above the average weight for a domestic cat of its age but within a normal range according to general veterinary guidance. Biscuit sat on the fence for approximately 40 seconds, looking down into the garden at 14. Biscuit then looked in a different direction for approximately 15 seconds. Then Biscuit stepped back off the fence on the number 18 side and disappeared. The whole visit lasted approximately 55 seconds. Gerald was approximately 60 centimeters away from Biscuit's position on the fence at the point of maximum proximity. Gerald did not react to Biscuit's presence in any observable way, which is consistent with the general understanding that snails do not have sufficiently developed sensory apparatus to detect the presence of a cat on a fence 50 to 60 centimeters away in the dark. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items it had contained previously. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width as it had been earlier. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was not relevant to Gerald or to the garden at number 14. Gerald reached the flat stone at 5:53. He paused at the edge of it for 30 seconds, then climbed onto its surface. The stone was still wet. Its temperature was slightly lower than it had been earlier in the afternoon, consistent with the drop in air temperature that typically occurs in October after sunset. Gerald moved to a position roughly in the center left of the stone and stopped. He was now approximately 1.3 centimeters from the position he had occupied on the stone at 4:52, when he had rested there previously. He began to retract more fully into his shell. This process took approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Gerald's foot gradually contracted, pulling the rest of his soft body into the shell until only a small portion of his foot was visible at the shell's opening. The shell itself sat on the surface of the stone, wet and still, in the light rain. In the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson drained the penne at 5:54. She used a colander that was kept in the cupboard below the sink. The colander was plastic, white, with small holes that were approximately 3 millimeters in diameter. She shook the colander twice to remove excess water, then tipped the penne back into the saucepan. She added the pasta sauce and the sliced courgette and stirred everything together over a low heat for approximately 3 minutes. She grated the Parmesan using a box grater. Gerald sat on the stone. The rain continued, lighter still. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. The rain continued, or did not continue, depending on which part of the evening is being described. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson ate their pasta at 5:59. They sat at the kitchen table, Mr. Patterson on the side nearest the window and Mrs. Patterson on the side nearest the door. They used their everyday pasta bowls, which were wide, shallow, cream-colored ceramic bowls purchased from a homeware shop in town approximately 3 years ago. The bowls had cost £12.99 each. Mr. Patterson told Mrs. Patterson about a meeting he had attended that afternoon at work. The meeting had lasted an hour and 20 minutes and had covered 3 agenda items, of which the third had been deferred to a subsequent meeting due to time. Mrs. Patterson listened and made appropriate responses at appropriate intervals. She asked whether the first agenda item had been resolved. Mr. Patterson said it had been largely resolved, pending a follow-up from a colleague named Sarah, who had been copied on the relevant email. Mrs. Patterson said she had spoken to her mother on the phone that afternoon. Her mother, who lived in a town approximately 40 miles away, had mentioned that she was having some work done on her guttering. Mrs. Patterson had said she would mention it to Mr. Patterson. She mentioned it now. Mr. Patterson said that sounded like a good idea. Outside, Gerald remained on the flat stone, fully retracted into his shell. The rain had eased further. It was now barely more than a very light drizzle. The garden was wet. This had been the case for some time and continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items it had contained previously. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width as it had been earlier. The Pattersons finished their pasta at 6:14. The meal had taken approximately 15 minutes to eat, which was a fairly typical duration for a weeknight dinner at number 14. Mrs. Patterson collected the bowls and took them to the sink. Mr. Patterson collected the glasses, which had contained tap water, and brought them to the sink also. Mrs. Patterson rinsed the bowls and placed them in the dishwasher. Mr. Patterson did the same with the glasses. Mrs. Patterson added the saucepan, which she had rinsed briefly, to the dishwasher. She added a dishwasher tablet from a box kept under the sink and set the dishwasher to the standard 60-degree cycle, which would take 1 hour and 12 minutes. In the garden, the rain had now eased to a point where it could more accurately be described as a fine mist than a rain. The surfaces of the garden, the lawn, the path, the stone, the shed roof, were all still very wet, and would remain so for some time. The draining sound of the rivulet along the path had reduced to an intermittent trickle. Gerald remained on the flat stone. He had been on the flat stone, fully or partly retracted, for a cumulative total of approximately 22 minutes across 2 separate visits that evening. He showed no signs of intending to move again in the immediate future. His shell sat on the wet surface of the stone without moving. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was not relevant to Gerald or to the garden at number 14. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. The rain continued, or did not continue, depending on which part of the evening is being described. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. At 6:21, Mr. Patterson went to the living room and turned on the television. The television was a 65-inch screen, purchased 18 months ago to replace an older model that had developed a fault with the backlight. The new television had cost £649 in a sale and had been delivered on a Tuesday by a man in a van who had been given a cup of tea but had declined a biscuit. Mr. Patterson sat in the armchair on the right side of the living room. He looked through the television guide for approximately 4 minutes before settling on a nature documentary that had begun 7 minutes earlier. The documentary was about coastal ecosystems. A narrator was describing the feeding habits of a species of shore crab in a calm, measured voice. Mr. Patterson watched this for a few minutes. He found it mildly interesting. Mrs. Patterson joined him at 6:26. She sat on the sofa. She asked what he was watching. He told her. She said that was fine. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a few minutes, then put it down and watched the documentary. The shore crab had moved on. The documentary was now covering a type of sea anemone. Outside, Gerald had not moved. The mist had almost stopped. The garden was quiet and wet and dark. Gerald sat on the stone. The garden was wet. This had been the case for some time and continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items it had contained previously. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width as it had been earlier. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was not relevant to Gerald or to the garden at number 14. At 6:47, something moved in the garden. It was not Gerald. Gerald had not moved since 5:53. The thing that moved was a hedgehog, which had come through a small gap at the base of the fence panel nearest the shed, a gap that measured approximately 9 centimeters wide and 7 centimeters tall, which was sufficient for a hedgehog of average size to pass through, and which had been there since the previous spring when the ground had shifted very slightly following a period of frost. The hedgehog moved across the lawn in a purposeful manner, snuffling at the wet grass as it went. Hedgehogs are considerably faster than snails. This particular hedgehog crossed the full width of the lawn in approximately 40 seconds. It paused briefly near the wooden border of the flower bed, investigated something in the grass with its nose, and then moved on toward the shed. It went around the right-hand side of the shed and disappeared from the main area of the garden. The whole visit to the visible portion of the garden lasted approximately 1 minute and 20 seconds. Gerald remained on the flat stone. The hedgehog did not go near the flat stone. The two animals were at their closest point approximately 80 centimeters apart, which was when the hedgehog was near the wooden border. There is no evidence that either animal was aware of the other. The mist had stopped entirely by this point. The garden was wet and still and quiet. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. The rain continued, or did not continue, depending on which part of the evening is being described. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This had been the case for some time and continued to be the case. The garden at 14 Orchard Lane was quiet now. The rain had stopped at 6:51, which was 24 minutes earlier than the weather app had predicted. The surfaces were still wet and would remain so throughout the night. The temperature had dropped to approximately 8 degrees Celsius, which is a normal temperature for a garden in Martinwick in October at this time of evening. Gerald remained on the flat stone. He had been fully retracted into his shell for approximately 57 minutes. His shell sat on the surface of the stone, still and quiet, in the dark. A small quantity of moisture had collected in the shallow depression around the base of his shell where it met the stone's surface. Inside the house, the nature documentary had finished at 7:30. Mr. Patterson had watched most of it. Mrs. Patterson had watched approximately half of it and had spent the other half looking at something on her phone. The documentary had covered, in addition to the shore crab and the sea anemone, a type of flatfish, a colony of mussels, and a brief segment about the impact of rising sea temperatures on kelp forests, which Mr. Patterson had found the most interesting part. The dishwasher was still running. It had 23 minutes remaining on its cycle. The kitchen light was still on. The rectangle of yellow light still fell across the left portion of the concrete path. Gerald was still not in it. The garden was still and quiet and dark and wet. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items it had contained previously. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width as it had been earlier. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was not relevant to Gerald or to the garden. The dishwasher at number 14 Orchard Lane completed its cycle at 7:53. It made a brief series of beeping sounds to indicate that the cycle was complete. Mrs. Patterson heard this from the living room and noted it. She did not immediately go to the kitchen to unload it, as the program she and Mr. Patterson were now watching, which was a quiz show, had not yet finished. The dishwasher would be unloaded later, or possibly in the morning. Mr. Patterson answered 2 of the quiz show questions correctly during the course of the program. The first was a question about the capital of Portugal, to which the answer was Lisbon. The second was a question about the height of Mount Everest, to which the answer was 8,849 meters, though Mr. Patterson said 8,848, which had been the accepted figure until a revised measurement was published in 2020. The program accepted his answer. Mrs. Patterson answered one question correctly, which was a question about a British actress whose name it is not necessary to include here. In the garden, Gerald had still not moved. His shell remained on the flat stone. The garden was quiet and dark. A light wind had begun, which moved through the garden occasionally in brief, soft gusts, causing a slight rustling in the fence panels and a small movement in the remaining damp leaves on the rose bushes. Gerald's shell did not move in the wind. It was too heavy and too low to the ground to be meaningfully affected. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The quiz show finished at 8 o'clock. Mr. Patterson said he was going to make a cup of tea. Mrs. Patterson said she would also have one. Mr. Patterson went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. He used the same kettle that had been used earlier. He filled it to the 2-cup line, which corresponded to approximately 650 milliliters. This was slightly more water than was strictly necessary for 2 cups of tea, but within normal domestic usage patterns. While the kettle was boiling, Mr. Patterson looked out of the kitchen window at the garden. The garden was dark. He could see the concrete path in the light from the kitchen window and the vague shape of the lawn and the shed beyond it. He could not see Gerald. Gerald was on the flat stone, which was not visible from this angle at this time of night. Mr. Patterson made 2 cups of tea. He used 2 mugs, both from a set of 4 that the Pattersons had bought from a kitchen shop in town. The set had cost £18 for all 4. One of the 4 mugs had been broken the previous year when it fell from the drying rack onto the kitchen floor. It had broken into 3 pieces. The remaining 3 mugs were in regular use. Mr. Patterson added milk to both mugs but sugar only to his own. He carried both mugs to the living room. Gerald had not moved. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. At 8:17, Gerald moved. He extended slowly from his shell, beginning with his foot and then his head and then his antennae, over a period of approximately 3 minutes and 10 seconds. He then remained still for a further 1 minute and 40 seconds with his antennae extended, before beginning to move across the surface of the flat stone toward its far edge. Gerald reached the far edge of the flat stone at 8:23 and descended to the soil at its base. The soil was still wet but slightly less wet than it had been during the height of the rain earlier that afternoon. Gerald moved along the base of the stone in the direction of the fence, following roughly the same path he had taken on his earlier excursion, though not precisely the same path, as Gerald had no mechanism for retracing an exact route. In the living room, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson were watching another program. It was a drama series. Mr. Patterson had seen the previous 3 episodes of this series. Mrs. Patterson had seen 2 of them. She had missed the 3rd because she had been on a video call with a friend. Mr. Patterson gave her a brief summary of what she had missed before the program began. His summary lasted approximately 90 seconds and covered the main plot developments. Mrs. Patterson said that was helpful. Gerald continued to move through the dark, wet garden. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. By 8:31, Gerald had covered approximately 42 centimeters from the base of the flat stone. He had moved in a direction that was roughly parallel to the right-hand fence, at a distance of approximately 18 to 22 centimeters from it. His path had been neither perfectly straight nor dramatically curved. It had been the kind of path that snails make, which is to say slightly irregular and not apparently purposeful in any human sense of that word. Gerald paused at 8:31 near a small depression in the soil where water had pooled slightly. The pool was approximately 6 centimeters across and perhaps 3 millimeters deep at its deepest point. Gerald investigated the edge of it with his antennae for approximately 50 seconds. He then moved around the left side of the pool and continued. The light wind that had begun earlier continued to move through the garden intermittently. The gap between gusts was irregular, ranging from approximately 20 seconds to approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The gusts themselves were brief, typically lasting between 4 and 8 seconds. None of them were strong enough to dislodge any of the remaining damp leaves from the rose bushes, although one gust caused a small quantity of water to fall from the shed roof, where it had been collecting in a slight depression near the back edge, onto the concrete path below. The quantity of water was small. It made a soft sound on the path. Gerald did not appear to notice any of this. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. Gerald reached the wooden fence at 8:39. He paused at the base of it, where the bottom of the fence panel met the soil. He investigated the fence panel with his antennae for approximately 1 minute and 5 seconds. Then he began to climb it. The fence panel was, as previously noted, 1.8 meters high. Gerald climbing a fence panel of this height would, at his current pace, take approximately 1 hour and 12 minutes under optimal conditions. Whether Gerald intended to climb the full height of the fence is not something that can be determined. Snails frequently begin climbing vertical surfaces and stop at various points before reaching the top, for reasons that are not always apparent. Gerald climbed for approximately 11 centimeters before stopping. He remained at 11 centimeters for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, partly retracted. He then continued climbing, reaching a height of approximately 19 centimeters before pausing again. This pause lasted 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Inside the house, the drama series continued. A character whose name was apparently David had said something that caused Mrs. Patterson to make a sound of mild surprise. Mr. Patterson, who had seen the relevant episode, said nothing, as he did not want to spoil what happened next. Mrs. Patterson asked if he had known that was going to happen. Mr. Patterson said yes. She said he could have warned her. He said she had said she did not want to know. Gerald continued to cling to the fence at a height of 19 centimeters. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Mrs. Patterson watched the interior design program for approximately 25 minutes before deciding to go to bed. She turned the television off at 9:31. She collected her mug and Mr. Patterson's mug from the living room and took them to the kitchen. She rinsed both mugs and placed them on the drying rack rather than in the dishwasher, as the dishwasher had already completed its cycle for the evening and it did not seem worth running it again for 2 mugs. She checked the back door was locked. It was locked. It had been locked since 6:48 when Mr. Patterson had locked it after getting home, though Mrs. Patterson did not know the exact time. She checked the front door was locked. It was. She turned off the kitchen light. The rectangle of yellow light that had been falling across the left portion of the concrete path since approximately 5 o'clock disappeared. The garden was now entirely dark, illuminated only by the ambient glow of the overcast sky. In the garden, Gerald had by now moved approximately 1.1 meters from the fence and was on the lawn. He was moving slowly in a direction that was roughly toward the flat stone, though as noted previously it would be an overstatement to describe this as intentional navigation. The garden was now fully dark and quiet. The wind had dropped. There was no rain. There was no movement except Gerald, moving slowly across the dark wet lawn. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. Gerald reached the concrete path at 9:44. He paused at the edge where the lawn met the path for approximately 40 seconds, then moved on to the concrete. The concrete was wet and cooler than the lawn had been. Gerald moved across the path at his usual pace, crossing the crack without incident for the 3rd time that evening, and reached the base of the flat stone at 9:51. Gerald remained at the base of the flat stone for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. During this time he extended and retracted his antennae several times in a pattern that had no obvious periodicity. Then he began to climb the edge of the stone. The stone was, as previously noted, a piece of York sandstone approximately 4 centimeters thick at its thickest point. Gerald reached the top surface of the stone in approximately 1 minute and 30 seconds. The garden was very quiet at this time of night. The house at number 14 was dark, all lights having been turned off by 9:48 when Mrs. Patterson had gone upstairs. The houses on either side were also largely dark, with the exception of a light in an upstairs room at number 16 which remained on until approximately 10:15 and then went off. The street beyond the houses was quiet. An occasional car could be heard passing on the main road approximately 240 meters away, but these sounds were faint and infrequent. Gerald moved to the center of the flat stone and stopped. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Gerald began to retract into his shell at 9:58. The process of full retraction took approximately 3 minutes and 20 seconds, which was slightly longer than his previous retraction that evening, possibly because the temperature had dropped further and snail movement generally slows in cooler conditions. By 10:01, Gerald was fully retracted into his shell. Only the very base of his foot was visible at the opening of the shell. The shell sat on the flat stone. The flat stone sat in the garden. The garden sat behind the house at 14 Orchard Lane. The house sat on Orchard Lane, in the town of Martin Wick, which had a population of approximately 11,400 people, most of whom were now asleep. The temperature in the garden was approximately 6.5 degrees Celsius. The humidity was high, as it typically is after a prolonged period of rain. The sky above was still overcast, which meant there were no stars visible and no direct moonlight, though the moon was in fact in its waxing gibbous phase and would have been visible had the cloud cover not been present. The ambient light level in the garden was low but not completely dark, the overcast sky reflecting the lights of the town in a faint, even, orange-gray glow that illuminated the garden to roughly the level of very deep dusk. Gerald did not emerge from his shell again that evening. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. And so the garden at 14 Orchard Lane settled into the quiet of a wet October night. The lawn was dark and still. The concrete path was dark and still. The flat stone was dark and still. Gerald's shell sat on it, small and quiet and completely motionless, exactly as it would continue to sit for the remainder of the night. The fence panels were damp. The shed was locked. The rose bushes in the flower bed stood in the dark, their last remaining flowers softened and flattened by the day's rain. The small pool of water near the right-hand fence had not changed significantly. The crack in the concrete path remained approximately the same width as it had been that morning, and the morning before that. If you are still listening, you have now heard the complete account of Gerald's Thursday. He emerged from beneath the flat stone at 3:47 in the afternoon. He crossed the lawn twice. He crossed the concrete path 3 times. He briefly investigated a fallen leaf, a small embedded stone, a patch of moss, a fence panel, a small pool of water, and a wooden garden border. He ate 2 very small quantities of organic material. He climbed and descended the wooden border twice and the fence once. He is now asleep. That is the complete summary of Gerald's day. Nothing else happened. If you were hoping for something else to happen, I'm afraid this is all there is. Rest well. Good night. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The garden at 14 Orchard Lane settled into the quiet of a wet October night. The lawn was dark and still. The concrete path was dark and still. The flat stone was dark and still. Gerald's shell sat on the flat stone, small and quiet and completely motionless. The fence panels were damp. The shed was locked. The rose bushes in the flower bed stood in the dark, their last remaining flowers softened and flattened by the day's rain. The small pool of water near the right-hand fence had not changed significantly since it had formed earlier that afternoon. The crack in the concrete path remained approximately the same width as it had been that morning, as it had been the morning before that, and as it had been for the approximately 19 months since it first appeared in the winter of 2019. The temperature had dropped to approximately 5.8 degrees Celsius, which is within the normal range for a garden in Martin Wick in October at this time of night. The wind had dropped entirely. There was no rain. There was no movement of any kind visible in the garden. Even the rose bush leaves, which had been moving slightly in the earlier gusts, were now completely still. Gerald's shell sat on the flat stone. Gerald was inside the shell, fully retracted, as he had been since 9:58. He did not intend to emerge again until morning, assuming conditions were suitable, which they may or may not be, depending on the weather. The garden was quiet. Nothing happened. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing changed. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. After the fox left, the garden returned to complete stillness. There was no further movement of any kind that could be observed for the next 47 minutes. The ambient light level remained the same. The temperature continued to drop very gradually. By 11 o'clock it had reached approximately 5.1 degrees Celsius. Inside the house, both Mr. and Mrs. Patterson were asleep. Mr. Patterson had fallen asleep at approximately 10:05, which was typical for him on weeknights. Mrs. Patterson had fallen asleep at approximately 10:31, which was slightly later than usual, possibly because she had been looking at her phone after getting into bed. The bedroom light had gone off at 10:29. The house was now entirely dark from the outside, with the exception of a small orange light on the boiler in the kitchen, which was always on, and a faint blue light from the router in the hallway, which was also always on. The dishwasher had been unloaded at 9:46 by Mrs. Patterson before she went to bed. The bowls, glasses, and saucepan from dinner were now in their correct places in the relevant cupboards and on the relevant shelves. The kitchen was tidy. The world's okayest gardener mug was on the drying rack, as Mrs. Patterson had rinsed it by hand rather than putting it in the dishwasher. Gerald's shell continued to sit on the flat stone. Nothing changed. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was unrelated to Gerald. At 11:14, it began to rain again. The rain started very lightly, as a fine mist similar to what the rainfall had become by late afternoon, and gradually increased over the following 12 minutes to a light but consistent drizzle. This was not what the weather app had predicted. The weather app had predicted the rain would stop at 7:15 and not return until the following morning. Weather prediction at the local level is an imprecise science. The rain fell on the garden at 14 Orchard Lane as it had been falling on and off throughout the day. It fell on the lawn, on the concrete path, on the shed roof, on the fence panels, on the rose bushes, on the flat stone, and on Gerald's shell. Gerald's shell being a shell, it provided complete waterproof protection for Gerald, who was inside it. The rain was not a concern for Gerald in any practical sense. The sound of the rain on the shed roof was a soft, irregular pattering. The sound of the rain on the concrete path was a slightly harder pattering. The sound of the rain on the lawn was almost inaudible, the grass absorbing most of the sound. The sound of the rain on Gerald's shell was very quiet, the shell being small and the rain being light, but it was there if one were in a position to hear it, which no one at number 14 currently was, as everyone was asleep. The rain continued. Gerald's shell continued to sit on the stone. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing changed. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The rain continued at a light but consistent level until approximately 12:47 in the morning, at which point it began to ease again. By 1:15 it had stopped entirely for the second time that evening. The total rainfall for the day in Martin Wick was later recorded by the local weather station as 14.3 millimeters, which placed it in the top 20% of rainy days for October in that region over the preceding decade. Gerald had not moved since 9:58. He had now been fully retracted in his shell for approximately 4 hours. This is not unusual for a garden snail. Garden snails can remain retracted in their shells for extended periods, sometimes days or even weeks in very cold or dry conditions. October night temperatures in the range of 5 degrees Celsius are cool but not cold enough to trigger extended dormancy in a garden snail of Gerald's type. Gerald was simply resting, in the way that snails rest, which is to say without any observable external sign of what, if anything, was occurring internally. The garden was wet and quiet. The puddle near the right-hand fence had grown slightly larger during the second period of rain and was now approximately 9 centimeters across. The rivulet along the concrete path had reformed during the rain and then stopped again after it ended. The crack in the path was unchanged. The shed continued to contain the lawnmower, the 2 folding chairs, the bag of compost, and the unopened tin of wood stain. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was unrelated to Gerald. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing changed. At 1:43 in the morning, a light came on in the upstairs bathroom of number 12, the house on the left side of number 14. The light was visible from the garden at number 14 as a faint rectangle of frosted glass in the upper portion of the bathroom window. It remained on for approximately 4 minutes and then went off again. No further lights appeared in any of the surrounding houses for the remainder of the night. The street was quiet. The occasional car that had been audible on the main road earlier in the evening had now stopped entirely. There was no wind. The temperature had dropped to approximately 4.3 degrees Celsius, which was the lowest it would reach that night. It would begin rising again very slowly after approximately 4 in the morning. Gerald's shell sat on the flat stone in the dark and the quiet. There was nothing to report about Gerald. Gerald was a snail in a shell on a stone in a garden in the middle of the night. His shell had not moved. His foot had not extended from the opening of the shell. His antennae had not appeared. Gerald was, as far as could be determined from any external observation, simply existing within his shell in a state that was consistent with rest or sleep, to whatever extent those concepts apply to snails. The night continued. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was unrelated to Gerald. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Between 1:43 and 3:51 in the morning, nothing of any significance occurred in the garden at 14 Orchard Lane. The temperature rose very slightly from its lowest point. The puddle near the fence remained at approximately the same size. The damp surfaces of the path, the stone, and the shed roof began, very slowly and imperceptibly, to lose some of their moisture to the still night air. Gerald did not move. A spider, which had been in a corner beneath the shed roof since approximately 9 in the evening, moved a short distance along a section of web at 2:17. This is included for completeness rather than because it is of any particular interest. The spider then stopped. It did not move again during the period covered by this account. At 2:58, a hedgehog, which may or may not have been the same hedgehog that visited earlier, passed through the gap in the fence and crossed the garden in a different direction than before, this time moving from the shed side toward the flower bed. It paused at the wooden border for approximately 25 seconds and then returned to the fence gap and left. Gerald was approximately 1 meter away from the hedgehog at the point of closest proximity. Neither animal acknowledged the other. The garden continued to be quiet and dark and wet. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing changed. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was unrelated to Gerald. At 3:51 in the morning, the sky above Martin Wick began to clear in the northwest. The cloud cover, which had been complete since before the rain began the previous afternoon, started to break up very slowly as a weather system moved through. By 4:15, patches of clear sky were visible between the clouds, and by 4:30, approximately a third of the visible sky above the garden at 14 Orchard Lane was clear. Stars became visible in the clear portions of the sky. They were not particularly dramatic stars, being largely the same stars that are visible from any point in southern England on a clear October night, which is to say a moderate number of them against a dark but not completely black sky, the ambient light of the town reducing the darkness considerably. Orion was partially visible, as was the Plough. Various other stars were visible whose names and constellations it would take too long to enumerate here. The temperature dropped slightly further as the cloud cover reduced, as cloud cover at night has an insulating effect. By 4:45, the temperature in the garden was approximately 3.8 degrees Celsius. This was the actual lowest point of the night, lower than the earlier recorded low, due to the clearing sky. Gerald's shell continued to sit on the flat stone. Gerald had not moved for approximately 7 hours. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing changed. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. At 5:07 in the morning, the first very faint suggestion of dawn appeared at the eastern edge of the sky. It was not visible from the garden at number 14 directly, as the eastern sky was behind the house. However, the overall quality of the darkness began to change very slightly, shifting from the deep dark of the middle of the night towards something marginally less dark. This change was so gradual as to be almost imperceptible at any given moment. Mr. Patterson's alarm went off at 6:15. It was set to a sound described in his phone's settings as gentle rise, which began very quietly and increased in volume over a period of approximately 90 seconds. Mr. Patterson turned it off after approximately 40 seconds. He lay in bed for a further 4 minutes before getting up. Mrs. Patterson did not have an alarm set. She typically woke between 6:45 and 7:15 on weekdays. In the garden, the light was continuing to increase very slowly. The shapes of the lawn, the path, the shed, and the fence were becoming gradually more distinguishable from one another as the dawn progressed. The flat stone was not yet clearly visible, being low to the ground and in the shadow of the raised flower bed, but it was there, as it had been all night. Gerald had not moved. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was unrelated to Gerald. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing changed. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period. The garden was wet. This continued to be the case. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. At 7:04 in the morning, the garden at 14 Orchard Lane was quiet in the early gray light of an October morning. The rain was gone. The wind was gone. The night was gone. The surfaces were still wet, but the wetness was different now, the particular stillness of surfaces drying slowly in cool morning air rather than the active wetness of rain. Gerald's shell sat on the flat stone, exactly where it had been since 9:58 the previous evening. 9 hours and 6 minutes in the same position, on the same stone, in the same garden, on the same road, in the same town. If you are still here, still listening, then you have followed Gerald through one very ordinary, very quiet, very uneventful Thursday in October. He moved a little. He ate a small amount. He climbed some things and came back down from them. He went back to his stone. He went to sleep. Nothing else happened. That is the whole story. I hope you are comfortable. I hope your breathing has slowed. I hope the day that has been and the day that is coming feel, just for this moment, a little further away than they usually do. Rest now. There is nothing else to hear tonight. The garden is quiet. Gerald is asleep. And you can be too. Good night from Sleepy Wilds. Gerald did not have any thoughts about any of this. Gerald was a snail. The fence panels continued to be damp. The shed continued to contain the same items. The concrete path remained wet. The crack in the path remained approximately the same width. Somewhere on Orchard Lane, a car drove past without stopping. This was unrelated to Gerald. Gerald's shell sat on the stone without moving. It had been doing this for some time. Gerald remained where he was. The garden remained as it was. Nothing changed. Nothing of any particular significance occurred during this period.